Then we go on to, after the summary, we can go on to dialectic. This is the way Hegel operates. I did this for a reason because I think this will help us really understand the process better. Okay, so this, I hope this gives us a different level, right? So if you remember, we began with the unconditioned universal. So Hegel is always working, to go through this step by step. He's working through the attitude, right? The phenomenological attitude, which can be a kind of suspension of our previous belief systems, our ordinary ways of looking and constituting things, right? So the attitude is always happening. So we're going through an attitudinal shift about what understanding is. Then to the introduction, which begins a kind of summary in this chapter we read last week of the sense certainty and perception, and then the theme of the chapter, right, is announced, right, which will be about force and understanding. So the dialectic begins with the unconditioned universal, right? And this has both an introduction to it, which we read last week, and also, again, another dialectic is happening, the tensions between what can be a universal and conditioned, and etc. Then he will go on after this, after the universal, to the second part, which is unique force. Remember that? I mean, we talked about that last week, right? And in this, we have, again, an introduction, right? Unique forces, and then we have the play of forces. So we have unique force, and then the play of forces. Right? And so you go through, again, another dialectic, or tension, right? Another supersession, if you will, right? An off-tempo, to the transition. And that transition leads us to 3, which is the internal, right? And the phenomena. Appears, right? If you remember that. Again, another introduction to this. This is, again, I'm trying to figure out with you, both for and with you, how Hegel operates. Then you have the dialectic, and of course the dialectic of the supersensible and world. And this historically is against Kant, and also against Christian theology, right? And then again, we have another tension that goes beyond that, another supersession, another dialectical move, right, into another transition, which goes to the second part after the supersensible, it's really divided into, this is the introduction. I think we should do it this way. 3A, the internal and the phenomena, and this would be 1, this would be, 1A of the dialectic, B, again, the dialectic against the supersensible, right, etc. The transition, and the transition is into, from A, the introduction, to B, which is Newtonian science. This is his moment, right? Again, the same thing happening here. Again, another introduction to Newtonian science, the play of forces, if you remember this too, force and gravity, You remember all this? So this is the historical reference. And what happens here is we begin to get a reversal of the world, a world reversal. Right? So the Newtonian revolution is affected, right, in terms of this understanding and force. Okay? You can read it okay? I'm sorry, I have very limited space. Yeah. So, anyway, the world reversal, right? And then we begin to get, a dialectic of notes on a philosophy of nature. This has to do, if you remember, too, the laws. Remember when he speaks about the laws? This is also Newton as well. Okay? And, we'll look at this in the text. So then he has notes on the philosophy of nature, and then also on crime and punishment. And Hegel had very good students in terms of law, including one of Marx's teacher, Edward Gans, was one of Marx's teachers on criminal law, which was quite interesting during that time. So anyway, I hope this helps. I mean, we'll go back to it and look at it. I did the same thing to introduce the next section, but let's go through this. Maybe this will help you understand a little bit better how he operates. And I'll probably try to do this for each section going forward. I think I picked up somewhat on the movement of Hegel's thought, rereading this and thinking it through, etc. So this is really about the movement of his thinking through the first 3 chapters. And look, this is a summation, and I know tonight you should have read the little section on the truth of self-certainty, B, self-consciousness, right? This new section. And what he's really doing is recapitulating through consciousness the first 3, which is sense certainty, perception, right, and the thing deceived, right? And then third and finally, force and understanding. Okay? So, if we go back, you can see, right, 132 proposition on page 79, you begin to see the first time the unconditioned universal, right? That is in the 4th line on 132. And again, this is the introduction, right? First of all, to put up the attitude of understanding, right? We're going to engage this through an attitudinal shift, right? Try to think of it this way, that you really basically have changed attitude. You've changed ground towards what you understand as Verstanden, right? What you understand as understanding. This is what his first move is, is to shift the attitudinal movement, right? The second move, of course, is then the summary, right, of what happened before in terms of how we're constituting these attitudes, right, as well as this dialectic of sense certainty and perception that precedes, right? So, and how the universal, so on page 134, he goes through in the first 3 sections, 132, 133, and 134, through the attitude all the way to the result as the unconditioned universal. Initially, in the negative and abstract sense, the consciousness negated its one-side notions and abstracted them. In other words, it gave them up, right? The shift, again, in attitude, the giving up. But the result has implicitly a positive significance in it, the unity, and this is new, the being for self and being for another is positive. In other words, the absolute antithesis is posited as a self-identical essence. So this is the subject-object at work, right, very early on. It's also the being for self and being for another, right? Yeah. And in Sartre and vocabulary, the for itself and the in itself, in terms of its movement. And this is happening very early on in Force and Understanding. But again, it implies a shift in what we mean by understanding, right? So Hegel is always going to, and again, think of this too as these spheres through the Aufhebung, right? This suppression, lifting higher, and retention going on. That the sphere, the bottom part of the sphere, right, that unfolds, is still retaining something, right? And as we go into the next dialectical unfolding, right, the attitude is changing, right? And we begin to shape another dialectical tension in which the two, being for self, being in itself, begin to shape into a new phenomena. And in this case, it will be the relationship between force and understanding. Okay? I mean, you kind of got, I mean, I don't know if I'm explaining it well enough, but, you know, I'll keep trying, right? So this unfolds. This unfolds, right, through this envelope, right? Mm-hmm. Transition is always when this has been enacted. Mm-hmm. Okay? When this has been enacted. So think about this as a kind of enabling, you know, reading strategy, if you will, of the process, right? Of the process of this going on. That he will introduce, and in the introduction, first he will shift attitudinal ground, right? Because remember the drive here for Hegel, the objective is to get to a presuppositionalist philosophy, right? So the attitudinal shift is to get away, again, from all the suppositories of the past, right? So we're going to go through the Kantian moment, the Newtonian moment, the Shelleyan moment. All of this is happening in this chapter, okay? And it's done through complex concept formations and reformations.
Makes sense.
Okay, does it make sense? I mean, yeah, good. I mean, if you can keep this in mind and then read it, yeah, what happened? You want to close the door?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
So you can see here, so then he'll come up with a new term, right? Here for this time, right? It's no longer just your basic universal, particular, and the singular, but it is the unconditioned universal in the understanding. And he introduces it, it begins with a dialectic, and then that's related, if you will, to unique force and the play of forces early on in the chapter. Right? Or in this section called Force and Understanding. So, yeah. I mean, again, I read from 135. I'm just going to try to highlight this because I do think we should move on. I mean, we could spend, you know, another 6 weeks just on force and understanding, literally. Anyway, what's that? I'm sorry?
Another time.
Another time, yes. Yeah. Another time period in the history of existence. Okay. But because, top of 81, 35, this unconditioned universal is an object for consciousness. And remember again, you're reading as objects for consciousness. Remember, you're presupposing always already here consciousness. This is the story, if you will, the narrative, but also the concept of what does it mean coming to consciousness. Right? What does this mean? And he doesn't have an unconscious like Freud, right? This is consciousness. Right? And self-consciousness going on, right?
Could you say that the other is kind of the unconscious, or not really?
No.
It's all just conscious.
A lot of this started with Lacan, the people around Lacan. I think it's a misappropriation. Yeah. He doesn't really posit an unconscious here.
That's interesting.
Yeah. He has a relationship to madness. Right, in a way, and reason and madness are playing through. If you knew, you know, autobiographically, Hegel's sister was mad, right? So he had a real interest in madness and what drove people mad. But at the same time, he was, And you also can try to think this through too, that Hegel is one of the first to really engage Antigone, right? as the ethical order. You know, he's the first of the modern philosophers who really engaged this. And I think I told you that Freud's brother-in-law, Martha Bernays, and I think her brother wrote the prize-winning essay for the Goethe Prize on Antigone. Yeah. One went the way of propaganda, the other way went the way of Greek tragedy, and of course Freud the way of founding of psychoanalysis. Pretty impressive family, right? Edward in the United States. I forgot the guy's name. I think it may be Joe, I'm not sure, but he won the prize-winning thing. And Martha was his wife, who he, was, into in the beginning, but as time went on, it happens, right? I guess, and vice versa. Okay, so anyway, so you kind of see, and what we're really doing here in the reading, hopefully, it's very different, it's maddening. You can see why Mallarmé goes mad reading this, in so many ways. That, in these transitions, you go to another, group of phenomena, right? You go from the play of forces, where the play of forces ultimately are superseded, right? Another way of talking about Offenburg is supersession. You supersede something. The French like putting into relief, or you lift up, in a way. This is an interesting word. It's very spherical, going back to what we were doing last night in terms of the perfect sphere in the pre-Socratics, especially in the Parmenidean system. Hegel's very Parmenidean in this way, in terms of the dialectic. It's also the movement of becoming and being. But in the transition, this becoming, in the transition here, will come to a new phenomena, a new introduction, a new attitude, right? Etc., and a new dialectical tension. And this tension is the most important because he's really trying to go beyond the Kantian supersensible world and also the split between phenomena and pneuma, right? Which ultimately is, taken up by the, reason and sensibility and the critique of pure reason. Right? So again, and then the historical moment, well, they're all historical moments, but the Newtonian science is engaged as a reversal of world.
Right? Old, that's what you said?
What's that, I'm sorry?
Reversal of old, you said?
Yes, of world.
Of world.
Not of old, no, of world. Right. Yeah. It's a world historical reversal.
Yeah.
He's beginning to see. So most people don't get into the Copernican turn with Descartes because they can't see it, right? So they only read Descartes flat, right? They don't really understand that he's really dealing with this dialectical reversal from the closed universe to the open infinity, in a way, in terms of the Copernican turn. And then to really look at the mathematization of the planetary orbits, etc. So this is going on. You have science, philosophy, and the movement of knowing happening all at once, right? And he's historicizing without using names. He's not saying according to Newton, as we know. He's not saying according to Kant, right? This is all densely packed into the text. So again, to the student, to the first comer to a book like this, it's like, what? Right. So, if you're grounded somewhat in the history of philosophy, you begin to try to see it in a different light. At the same time, you can be very burdened and crippled by all that knowledge of the history of philosophy, because then it piles up and you're not really thinking that clearly, You're kind of like, the trash collector, so to speak, too many things, right? So again, all of this is about being an object for consciousness. This is really about object for consciousness at this point. To lead up to the chapter that we're going to try to look at tonight and go forward with. Okay? So I'll just give you a couple of more things, the movement, he talks about 136. The movement is what is called force, right? The matters posited as independent directly pass over into their unity, and their unity directly unfolds its diversity, and this once again reduces itself to unity. but this movement is is called force. One of its moments, the dispersal of the independent matters in their immediate being, is the expression of force, but force taken as that in which they have disappeared is force proper. This is unique force that I put up, right? A unique force before we get to the play of forces, right? First, however, driven back into itself, must express itself, and secondly, it is still force remaining within itself in the expression, just as much as its expression in the self-containedness. When we thus preserve the two moments in their immediate unity, the understanding to which the notion of force belongs is, strictly speaking, the notion which sustains the different moments as different, for in themselves they are not supposed to be different. Consequently, the difference exists only in thought. That is to say, what has been posited in the foregoing is the first instance with which the notion of force, not its reality. Okay? So here he goes with the concept, right, over that of the reality, right? This is very much German idealism. In point of fact, however, force is the unconditioned universal, and that's why he's using it, right? Which is equal in its own self what it is for another, or which contains the difference in its own self, for difference is nothing else than being for another. This is what difference is. Yeah? This is page 82, from section 136, right? In order then that force may in truth be, it must completely set free from thought. It must be posited as the substance of these differences, that is, first the substance as this whole source, remaining essentially in it for itself, and then its differences as possessing substantial being, or as moments existing on their own account. Force as such, or as driven back into itself, thus exists on its own account as an exclusive one for which the unfolding, this is important, of the different matters is another subsisting essence. And thus two distinct independent aspects are set up. But force is also the whole, it remains, which is according to its notion, that is to say, these differences remain pure forms, superficial, vanishing moments. At the same time, there would be no difference at all between force proper, or unique force, which has been driven back into itself, and force unfolded onto independent matters if they had no enduring being, or there would be no force if it did not exist in these opposite ways. But that it does exist in these opposite ways simply means that the two moments are at the same time themselves independent. This is dialectics at work. I mean, again, this is a very good description passage of this at work. It is therefore this movement of the two moments in which they perpetually give themselves independence and then supersede themselves again, which we are now to consider. And this is first from the dialectic again to the transition, how it goes on. So you begin to see this at work, I think. If you want to reread, to reread this in this light, both as part of, this attitudinal shift, unique force, the play of forces, the transition in the dialectic, right, to the next level of the internal and the phenomenon. Right? This is going on. Absolutely. And then you have to think temporally as well. That understanding also has the temporal of the immediate in the beginning. The now time is very important here in play of forces and the relationship between force and understanding. You want to say something about your diagram or some thoughts?
No, I think we covered the last thing. This is kind of important for the next section though, right? This
yes.
Particular passage actually.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, go ahead. Speak, tell me. Yeah.
No, because it kind of sets up in more abstract terms kind of what the myth goes over in terms of meeting its other and the forces at play, etc.
Right. Absolutely.
Particularly.
Now, will this time will come around in the master-slave dialectic.
Right.
Even though he might not use the word will, he'll talk about interiorization, reinteriorization, and externalization. And this is going on in the multiple struggles. I was going to talk about that tonight, too, that there are multiple struggles going on in this master slave. This is the revolutionary part, of Hegel, in the sense of what does a revolution, include? What does it, what is really going on here? In terms of these moments. And there are many, many moments. It's not only that you risk your life, right? There's also another kind of struggle that's going on for recognition, etc. And you can see where Marx, picked up a lot of this. The Stand and the struggle, the lutte in the French, or the tension is really picked up very actively by Marx in a dialectical way. It's not just that you're there and someone else is here and there's a standoff. That's not the issue. The issue is much more complicated than that in many ways, right? Just like in the sense that Lacan picked this up in terms of the four discourses, and especially in the analyson and the analyst relationship, and the subject that's supposed to know. Right? I think this is very much taken from the Kojèvian reading of the master-slave dialectic, which is in this section before we get to shapes of consciousness, the skeptic, the stoic, and the unhappy consciousness. Yeah. Okay? Yeah. But tell me more about what you're thinking here in terms of the passage and some of this going on, because I can put up the next step. I mean, again, the philosophy of nature is there. He's kind of going back to his earlier stuff. There's a beginning of a critique of the Christian theological moment as well, when he criticized the supersensible, that realm that's beyond, right? That is put out there. And, the new Emil realm as well is being sort of slowly, deconstructed and positively destroyed as we go forward, right? Yeah. Anyway, maybe a good way of approaching this next section, and we can go back and forth, there's no question in my mind that this would be. By the way, I mean, section 162 is very, very important on double terms and the opposite. This is really on the doppelganger and doubling and redoubling. 162, proposition, page 100, 101. Very important, B. Newton, right? And pure, and the law, right? And the reversal. And they have a whole thing. Remember, we read a little bit about electricity last time in terms of the positive and negative.
I didn't read that far.
You didn't read that far?
Or did I?
No, you did, because that was last week.
Oh, last week.
Yeah,
Of course.
Yeah.
No, I thought we were in the other.
But maybe we could begin with the summation at the end that Hegel does on page 102, after we get through, of course, this, internal movement and the phenomena. And he says in section 165, we see that in the inner world of appearance, and remember, appearance is what we're dealing with here, the structure of how things phenomenalize themselves. The understanding in truth comes to know nothing else but appearance, but not in the shape of a play of forces, but rather that play of forces in its absolutely universal moments and in their movement. In fact, the understanding only experiences only itself. Raised above perception, consciousness exhibits itself closed in a unity with the supersensible world through the mediating term of appearance, through which it gazes into this background, what lies behind appearance. The two extremes of this syllogism, the one of the pure inner world, the other of the inner being, gazing into this pure inner world, have now coincided, and just as they, qua extremes, have vanished, right? So too, the middle term is something other then these extremes has also vanished. This curtain of appearance, we talked about this last week, but I think it's good to go back to this. Hanging before the inner world is therefore drawn away, and we have, the curtain's really ripped in a way, it's ripped apart. Right? The vision of the undifferentiated self-same being, which repels itself from itself, posits itself as an inner being containing different moments, but for which equally these moments are immediately not different self-consciousness. It is manifest that behind the so-called curtain, which is supposed to conceal the inner world, there is nothing to be seen unless we go behind it ourselves, as much in order that we may see, so there may be something behind there which can be seen. But at the same time, it's evident that we cannot, without more ado, go straightway behind appearance. For this knowledge of what is the truth of appearance, as ordinarily conceived as inner being, is itself only a result of a complex movement whereby the modes of consciousness, meaning, perceiving, and understanding, vanish, and it will be equally evident that the cognition of what consciousness knows in knowing itself requires an even still more complex movement, the exposition of what is followed. Okay? So we really don't know how we're coming to this self-knowledge. How do we really ultimately get to this position of the knower and the known? Mm-hmm. Okay? So he's, trying to go there. After he's recapitulated, remember, we've been through 3 chapters. Once again, the sense certainty, right? The perception through consciousness as objects, and then now the force and understanding. Yeah? Okay? Hard stuff, huh? It gets, yeah.
So yeah, it just gets exhausting.
It's exhausting, yeah. No, you can see why Mallarmé went down. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Well, you have to have really the power of negative thinking.
Yeah.
This is another thing that's very hard for us to read because we're not really in this position of where we're going through levels of determinate negation along the way. This negative dialectic that Adorno is so good at is not really operative in our basic constitutions as, Anglo, Americans, trying to learn this stuff. And it's not that easy for the German either, reading in the original, right?
That's true.
Yeah. So, but anyway, to think about this in terms of he's going through these negations, I didn't put that up there, but there is this antithetical moment, right, that is really happening all the time, right? There is this, right? And this is why I think some people said when they heard him lecture, it was like hearing death speak itself. There's this constant, negation, negative thinking going on, right? So, delayering, desubjectivating, etc. Right? So think of this as, what I'm doing today, attitudinal shifts, right? Right? Dialectical tensions, constantly, right? Determinate negation, getting to transition, getting through spheres where you retain a little bit because what you're retaining after you should be at this stage to the point of where you can make a transition to consciousness and look back and say, this and that's part of sense certainty. That's not knowledge. That's not on my path anymore. But I understand where it's coming from, right? Your perceiving, and being is no longer, that relevant to your knowing. However, the limitations of perception, right? Those limitations. And the same thing about the limits of understanding before we get to the more complex notion of self-consciousness and understanding, until we go beyond the reflexive, right, into more the refractive. Yeah. If that helps, I hope so, and it's okay, so maybe we should look at,
right.
Unless you want to stop for a second and ask any questions or any thoughts you may have.
The refractive as a recognition of the other is what you're saying, right?
To a degree, but at the same time, you're getting beyond again, saying I'm certain that this exists because of my senses.
Yeah.
That I'm in the immediate, moment there.
Right.
Yeah. You have to remember, we're going through so many levels of mediation to get to this point. He begins with the way the phenomena appears. That's why he starts with our senses and the sense certainty. And to go back to that chapter, in a way, where does he, end, right? Experience, right? Remember?
Right.
Yeah.
No, I understand getting rid of all the sensible world. I thought that was more in the recursive nature that you were sort of commenting on. I was trying to understand the refractive element.
Oh, okay.
And to me, that would, as my...
Well, yeah, maybe the refractive may be the being for other.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Or what the tane of the mirror.
Right.
That little sharp edge that gives you that little, you know what I mean? That little.
That's what you call that, the tane?
Tane. Entertainment.
Really?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
The tane. Yeah. Crucial term, huh? Entertainment, infotainment. Right? We're getting a little crack. A little crack. Okay? So maybe we should go to the truth of self-certainty here and start with this. Let me do this. Maybe I'll just erase this and I'll put up a couple of other things here, which is similar in terms of, again, this is basically outline and way of maybe reading and processing. Yeah. Okay. So. This time, this is going to be important for us.
Yeah.
This is going to be very important.
Desire.
Right? So.
How do you think about the word desire?
Well, you don't think about it.
Well, no, because in the back of this guy's commentary, he says need.
No. No, you're all completely off.
You don't think about it.
This is your movement.
Wait, I didn't see the other side.
You go to the psychoanalyst, they say, what do you want?
Yeah.
You tell what you want. The next question is, what do you really want? Right? Right? You're always in this position, right? To go back to Parmenides, we are all live lack.
Right.
In different ways. Right? In different ways. All live lack. On the other side of this, yes, is a need structure in which demand and other things are set up. Right? We went through this a little bit with Lacan.
Yeah.
Remember when we were doing the Freud.
Right.
Yeah. But the desire is never really, it can be spoken to a degree, but is never conceptualized.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. Because this is really, the libidinal energy that never can be fully expressed, right? Can never be fully structured in language, right? But it's ongoing play.
Right. Okay.
So he's going to look at this, right? The attitude of, not the psychoanalytic direction. But I promise you, this is one of the aspects that Lacan takes from Kojève's reading of Hegel. These are Anglo people, they don't know anything about design. I mean, in a sense, right? When you really think about it. Yeah, Miller, A.V. Miller.
No, the analysis is by J.N. Findlay.
Yeah, well, he's Anglo too. Yeah. Miller's the translator. He worked with Finlay on this. So remember this.
Live life.
This will help us. Yeah? We're never full. We're never quote plenum, like Bruno was talking about last night. It's never that fullness. No. This never is really reconciled because of this.
All right. Can you just explain the live lack part for me a little bit?
Well,
Or maybe I'm not getting that part.
well, it's okay. I mean, we're always in a lack of being, right?
Uh-huh.
We don't have that fullness ever in anything.
Right.
We feel satisfied
What's
to a
the
degree, the satisfaction, but we never really feel fully gratified or fully,
The lack I get. What's the live part?
Well, the live is where we're living it.
Just sort of,
This is lived experience.
Okay.
Lived experience, I'm sorry.
I get it.
should have said vécu, in French, I'm sorry, I'm translating
Got it.
quickly in my head. The experience of lack, right?
Uh-huh.
Constantly.
Okay.
You have what I don't like. You sit where, I want to be, therefore I want to, take your place in another place. These are all things that are going on in this structure, and this movement of desire. So he's going to begin this with consciousness, right? With the attitude of desire. Okay. Okay. Which cannot be, quote, defined or fixed in many ways. You may have a revolutionary desire, right? And that may be part of your consciousness and all of that. However, right? You're still always going to be in a position, right? And this is also about ideology. You ultimately have a lack, even after the revolution.
Right.
There's going to still be ideology. There's
Right.
going to still be that moment. Right? There'll be remnants. That's mine. No, it's not. We live in a community. It belongs to the community. No, that's mine.
It's all going to be perfect.
It's going to all be perfect, yes. Right, exactly. Okay? So, so when they say need, they're wrong. Really. I think it dilutes the meaning and the work in this chapter because you have multiple struggles. You have the struggle, first of all, the struggle for recognition, right? You have the struggle to death, right? You have the struggle and mastery.
Put it on the chart like your chart.
Okay.
I thought that was helpful.
Okay. So he goes in, right? And the first moment will be life. He's going to switch. He's going to start talking about life and self-consciousness. And the amazing thing about this, it's not deterministic. This is the beauty of a Hegelian system. You just don't say, that's life. Right? You just don't say, c'est la vie. You don't say, c'est la vie. That's what the people say. Exactly. See, Phil picks up on that. So anyway, So this relationship of life and self-consciousness, again, another thing, right? And this is going on in the first section, right? And we're going to have the descriptions of the consciousness of self vis-a-vis the first 3 chapters, right? Where this is where we begin. So you have the description, if you will, of the really become conscious. You begin to see things in terms of sense certainty. And you know that that's just a passage. You realize that that's just, a deceptive moment. The same thing with the perception. You say that's the way you see things, or that's how you see it, you're still not in self-conscious knowing and moving. Okay? I mean, if I can use these, vernacular propositions in that sense, right? Okay? So, the attitude of desire plays out, first of all, in chapter 2, I think it's actually 4b, right? But then we start to see this in terms of the independence and dependence, right? Of self-consciousness, lordship and bondage, right? Page 111. And we begin to see, right, the attitude of the struggle for recognition.
Right.
Now, this is a crucial moment because Lacan and others, and a group of Americans such as Jessica Benjamin, Joel Whitebook and others, and even Alex Honneth, all of whom consider themselves Hegelian in one way or another, are all interested in recognition, that struggle for recognition. Right? And they see this, right, in terms of first the dialectic, and the struggle to death. Right? You begin to see this working its way out, the struggle to death. And he gives you an introduction to this, the dialectic, and then the transition. And this leads again to here, to the master, mastery and servitude. And what happens with the master, it reaches an existential impasse. It hits the level of contradiction where it can go no more, the master. Right? In this process, what's going on is this relationship here, of where there's a process of interiorization and re-interiorization. Of which this section, again, in this movement of the dialectic, you see playing out very interestingly in Fanon, black skin, white masks in particular, as well as the wretched of the earth or the damned of the land. The damned of the land is probably even a better title, the damnation of those on the land. Anyway, in which the interiorization is taken up both in the double, consciousness way, in a very different way than Du Bois', much stronger Hegelian violence, right? In terms of Fanon. In Du Bois, is double consciousness. Yes, sir, boss, but I know what's going on, boss. Right? Yeah. I see those daughters of the Confederacy, but well, we're going to get them one day. Yeah. This is a problem with like Tarantino films. It's not dialectical. This thing of Jamie Foxx as Django Unchained, right? It's not really a dialectical moment there, in a sense.
True.
It's more superhero, transcending always,
right.
Too much, right? You don't see this kind of interiorization and re-interiorization going on in this process. This is a very important process vis-a-vis authority, master-slave, race relations, gender relations, all of these things really happening constantly in our daily lives in terms of the mastery, etc. Right? So this is the attitude, again, going back to desire, because what does the servant desire to be? Mastery over their own lives. The master does not exist unless recognized by the servant as such. If the servant or the slave stops recognizing the master, affording them that prestige, something can happen, right?
Something can happen.
Yeah, so, like revolution. Yeah. Great film. I don't know if you ever saw it. You probably saw it. Last Supper by Tomas Gutierrez Alea. Great film.
Yeah, Panther.
The Lost. Yeah. It ends with the panthers and the waterfalls. Beautiful images at the end. You've seen it, right? Yeah. Absolutely beautiful film. And it's about a slave uprising in 19th century Cuba. And the slave puts the master to sleep, and he puts on a head, right, and talks about the Cartesian lie, that's being lived.
Right.
It's a very beautiful sequence in terms of the history of philosophy. And then they start a rebellion. The master thinks he's being cute by inviting all the slaves to the Last Supper, like Jesus, during Easter time. Yeah.
What's the name of the film?
The Last Supper. Tomas Gutierrez Alea. And you can get it, I think it's available. It's a great filmmaker. He also did memoirs of other development and others. Alea Gutierrez. Tomas. One of their best filmmakers of the early period. 59. He was part of the thing on the manifesto with Esposito for an Imperfect Cinema, which was a treatise written in the Cuban, the Cuban and Latin American context. Glava Rocha, among others, were also involved with this. Solanos, who worked with Pontecorvo, on Byrne was involved.
Yeah.
So there are many, many figures who did this for the Imperfect Cinema. It was a document that the Imperfect Cinema did not need the great technology. Right, of Hollywood. We have enough to work with that film itself was a revolutionary art form. And that's what we can work with, the camera. Yeah. So this
Imperfect Cinema.
For an imperfect cinema. It was a plea going on. But it fits in this because it has an attitude of desire, usurping the master, right? The struggle for recognition of third world cinema,
Right.
and then we can be just as good, if not better. Nestor Alembros, you know him, the cinematographer? Some of the most beautiful images you'll ever see. He was one of the great cinematographers, period. I had the pleasure of meeting him in New Orleans completely by accident at a local, blues and club, Tipitinas in New Orleans. It was great, yeah. And he was very nice because he fell in love with some Guatemalan woman sitting at the next table, and he said, "You're going to be in my wedding." And he was very eager to marry her that night. So this used to be how things used to go. Today, it's like, you got to go through 50 levels of anxiety before you get to what's real or not. Anyway, right. Those are good days. I mean, in a sense. Yeah, we'll get married. Come on. We're going to go to New York. We're going to have the ceremony. The mother's at the table with her. They're all, anyway. But going back to this whole thing about, again, the Imperfect Cinema is an interesting play on dialectics, in the sense that, the fusion dialectical, the false fusion in Hollywood cinema, identification is not so dialectical. They became the Hegelian Marxists, if you will, of cinema. That's why I bring them up, in a way, versus that of the Hollywood epochs that were made, Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, or, the nonsense that was made during this period, right? Yeah. The Vietnam movies, like Coming Home. What's dialectical about Coming Home? With Jane Fonda and John Voight. A dialectical film is Who'll Stop the Rain. Did you see that with Nick Nolte? Another great one. Michael Moriarty and Tuesday Weld. Who'll Stop the Rain? It's Carol Reese. Very great film about coming home from Vietnam. Nick Nolte is one of his great performances.
I think Nolte's underrated.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So, you begin to see these kind of differences. And I'm very interested in, dialectical cinema. Josh is doing some work on the Ziga Vertov group right now, which was one of the great Soviet, the fourth term of the dialectic was the camera. right? So, and very interesting stuff what Vertov did. I mean, most of you have seen The Man with the Movie Camera. That's a must. You have to go to re-education camps if you haven't seen that. But anyway, it's an essential viewing. The Man with the Movie Camera, and the Eisenstein, piece of the Notes on Cinema. This is an attack upon Eisenstein's traditional use of the dialectic and montage. It's interesting when you begin to think about this vis-a-vis Hegelian, and Vertov in some ways is going beyond the traditional Hegelian synthetic activity, the ground of the synthesis. So another way of reading this, to come back to the text, is to look at that ground of the synthetic activity. What is being brought together?
Right.
What is really being brought together? How do you see this unity?
Right.
Not of the apperception, but this unity of perception moving into understanding, into force. Where are these moments located, right? To think it through that way, to deal with this sort of like it's an epic film, and you're framing spherically each little sequence and scene, right? Even though you're retaining part of that earlier footage.
Right.
So I think this is another maybe way of looking at it. You're not just rewinding and going back and forth, right? There's a retention, the vanishing is somewhat retained, right? The dissolve is somewhat retained. Yeah, if you want to think of it that way. So anyway, we have this in terms of the, so we have the struggle to death, we have its introduction of the master, the slave interiorizes the master, the risk is the fight to death, the struggle for death, for the recognition that I am master like you, or I have the ability to terminate you, to assassinate or kill you. And one of the great, again, Hegelian filmic versions of this, I like film examples because I think they give us in a very condensed, temporal frame. A lot of this stuff, the celluloid is a great example, is the state of siege, Costas Gravas, in which Yves Montand is being interrogated by the left. It is a beautiful dialectical interrogation. It's about an 8-minute, 10-minute thing about his complicity, right, in that revolution. You know the film, State of Siege? That was after Z.
Yeah, is that when they're like the U.S. CIA guys being
Yes, but Montand, yes. Montand plays the agent.
Yeah.
He's being interrogated. They may take a vote on the bus.
Yeah.
Do you remember? I mean, it's a great film. I mean, I think it's much better than Z. Z has, Irene Baptist and Yves Montand has the right actors. But the State of Siege is much more interesting theoretically. They take a vote on the bus whether they're going to kidnap him and interrogate him. The left, the group, the revolutionary group also. So very interesting in terms of the unfolding, right? In that way.
Yeah, it's based, I think, on real life.
Bolivia, I think. Was it Bolivian? I think
no,
it was
I
Bolivian.
Think it was Uruguay.
It was Uruguay? Okay. Yeah, you're right. It was Uruguay.
Yeah.
That's true. I'm thinking.
They captured
the CIA agent there. Right. Yeah. Very, very interesting. Yeah, in that regard. Yeah. But that's another film really worth seeing. I mean, I really wish we had the capacity, hopefully we will soon, to just show films alongside these kind of texts. Where we could just go to the screen, you know what I mean? And say, okay, here it is. You really want to learn, here we go, Let's really, open it up finally. And instead of, the text, the conversation, back and forth. I mean, because you eliminate, in a way, the mediation of the referential, because then you have it right away to, to look at and engage. And this is why the left needs a theater, too. I mean, this is so important. You can't just be out there demonstrating and protesting all the time. It's not going to work. Right? You need to build a culture, and you need to know what that cultural background is. It's a struggle for memory. Our struggle for prestige and recognition now, our struggle, in many ways, the dialectical struggle to me life and the struggle for life and self-consciousness is built on the politics of historical memory. That's being erased. This is how brainwashing works. It erases memory. It brainwashes you into the new code that the capitalist, the neoliberal effort wants. Get you speaking the world of computer leads, right? Right? Text me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that's why they have to destroy the tapes.
That's right, something like that. Yeah. Okay. So this is the dialectical tension that's going on. The other attitude, if you will, in this section, that's very, very important to read carefully, and this is really the section that most radicals focus on, obviously, over the years, is the attitude of the struggle, freedom, right? And freedom and self-consciousness take shapes of consciousness. That would be the shape of the skepticism, the state of stoicism, and then of course the shape of unhappy consciousness, which is both Judaic and Christian. Right? So that's going on later here. Okay? And this goes on all the way to the end of the section, freedom of self-consciousness. Right? Mm-hmm. Right? Before we move into the next section, which is reason and/or the French Revolution. Right? Reason is really, in some ways, Robespierre speaking through Hegel. It's very interesting in that regard. So, two attitudes in this section on self-consciousness and life. Right? The attitude of desire and the attitude of freedom. Sartre, Lacan, and Freud. Right here in this section. The attitude of desire, right? And then the attitude of freedom as the spontaneous choice that we have at the base. Very interesting to me when you begin to put this into it. And the freedom here is about the pour soi, en soi relationship, or the, for itself, in itself. Relation, right? And here it's the Leben, life consciousness, the life world, and self-consciousness, which is Selbst. Yeah, Bewusstsein, right? As the Bewusstsein is the word for consciousness, right? And Selbst is the word for self-consciousness. So really this is the birth of a new self beyond the Cartesian cogito, right? This is another thing you have to see historically, that the cogito is being displaced here by a new term. Right? The I think, therefore I am. The cogito ergo sum is now being replaced by Selbstbewusstsein.
Does Hegel actually state that he's going after?
Well, I mean, it's implicit in the text, I think. It's not explicit, but it's constantly implicit. I mean, another way of reading this, I'm trying multiple different strategies to make it, somewhat accessible, because I know it's very hard the first time around, or the second time, third time around. But another way of looking at this is who's the implied reader? The implicit, explicit kind of strategy of reading. So who is the implied reader to whom he is addressing this? And the implied readers of his time are his friend Schelling, to overcome, this intuitive, intellectual intuition, and Fichte, to overcome this positing ego, etc., with this new terminology. So he's really inventing many new terms, right? But they're full. It's not like it's just a a babble, right? They're very full because they're thought through and they're dialectically shaped and molded. So he's really building something here. It's not like this is phony, oh, I just put label this, that, or label that, this.
Right.
He's really, really building something very, very carefully. Anyways, yeah. So, then you get to this, the second aspect, these attitudes of freedom, like I said, the skeptical, and going back to what Phil just said, Descartes and the skeptical consciousness. Descartes pushes skepticism to its limit. His main antagonists are the skeptics during his time. And hyperbolic doubt is a way of pushing the skeptics to the precipice, right? Pushing the skeptics into the abyssal plane and then finding that there's a thinking substance there.
Yeah, Adorno spends a lot of time comparing Hegel
To Descartes. No, it's very important methodologically. You begin to see a deductive system that ultimately becomes a dialectical system.
Right.
And he's very good at this, Adorno. He understands this very well. That's a great handbook, by the way, to read alongside of this. I think it's very helpful to go back to those lectures on dialectics, that
They're
Stanley, kind of surface.
That's what really kind of.
Right. Great book.
It's a great book.
Great, because it's a teaching guide. It's really first rate. Really first rate. Yeah. So, you begin to see the shapes of consciousness. So again, you're becoming so fully conscious that you're able to read the skeptic, you're able to read the stoical, and you're able to read the unhappy consciousness. And the unhappy consciousness becomes the ascetic as well. The types, right? You begin to get the types. The ascetic type is part of the unhappy consciousness. I remember during the 60s, I was not there, but I read about it and heard a lot about it. In 66, when Lacan, Derrida, many others, Levi-Strauss, were all in Baltimore for the structuralist symposium, which was a real event. I mean, I wish I'd been there. I was way too young also. But I heard that Tony Wilden, right, who ended up on the West Coast at Irvine at San Diego, and then he went up to Canada, to British Columbia, said something to Lacan, I'm your unhappy conscious translator. Right, in a way, right, and all the stuff he went through, because Wilden was the first translator of Lacan into English. The language of the self, it was a little Delta paperback. And he was the Montaigne scholar. And who's the major skeptic of his time? It was an essayist, Montaigne. So it's very interesting when you begin to start to try to put these things together. You need the key, Sean, or you're okay?
No, I.
Okay, all right. Okay. Anyway, I'll wait till you come. But anyway, any questions so far? I mean, I can get more into this, but this is the part of the phenomenology that Sartre, Fanon, Trine-Wachtel, to a degree, and lesser degrees, maybe Merleau-Ponty, Raya Dunashevka in Detroit, right, of the Hegelians, or the Hegelian Marxists, if you want to look at it, really focus upon, and of course, Alexander Kojève, and of course, Lacan, right, ultimately, is very affected by this moment between the independence and dependence of consciousness, and where we come to, And in Sartre's case, if you want to read this live, in terms of human relations, the Mid-Sein, the concrete relations with others chapter in Being and Nothingness is a very good, illustration of this in Being and Nothingness, which I hear the new translation is very good. I've not gotten it yet.
Of Being and Nothingness.
Of Being and Nothingness, like the section on the concrete relations with others. Right? Okay, we'll talk about this when John gets back. But anyway, and then reason is taken up by Lukács, certainly Adorno, and then certainly by Marcuse. In fact, writes a book called Reason and Revolution about Hegel, the political Hegel, more so. So we have the existential, kind of psychoanalytic Hegel in some ways. I'm not saying it's not political in that respect, because again, you have attitudinal changes going on, you know, and so I think it's now, you know, yeah, but you do have these divisions of where the Hegelian problematic takes different, you know, paths in the radical tradition, within the radical imagination, within the radical tradition in terms of positing and doing things. I think if political economists read this better, they'd be much better political economists. But they don't. You know, they're still fixated only on the political economy. Right? They don't really understand Marx is really trying to take down political economy fully. It's trying to lay bare the structure. It's not just criticizing Ricardo and Smith. You know, it's laying bare and structure. This is what these guys do. I mean, this is why it's the philosophical language of our time. You know? It's really pretty amazing. Yeah. Yeah. So you have, that comes out of this too, since I've, you know, titled this course also, and we're going to certainly continue in, I guess, late January, you know, with this. The Nietzschean moment, of course, of Herrschaften Bedulden, you know, the master formation and the cultural formation, how this works as a historical moment, right? A lot of this is taken from this Hegelian dialectic, I think. Yeah, the master formations, right?
Right.
Right. So we can talk about that too. Okay, so again, he's taking away the presuppositions in the beginning. You know, he summarizes force and understanding, and now he starts, if you want to turn to 166, this is on page, I think it's 104, yeah. The truth of self-certainty, self-consciousness. So remember, A, if you want to look at the structure of the book, going back to A is consciousness, Bewusstsein. Now we have Selbst, Bewusstsein, after 3 chapters, right? That already presupposes the knowledge of what is sense certainty, what is perception in the thing deceived, right? Or distorted, and then ultimately what is force of understanding. So he goes. The truth of self-certainty is the general, you know, title. Yeah. In the previous modes of certainty, what is true for consciousness is something other than itself. But the notion of this truth vanishes in the experience of it. What the object immediately was in itself, mere being in sense certainty, the concrete thing of perception. This is good summation. Again, why I put up, he introduces through a summation. And for the understanding of force proves to be in truth not this at all. Instead, the in itself turns out to be a mode in which the object is only for an other. A mode in which the object is only for another. The notion of the object is superseded in the actual object, or the first immediate presentation of the object is superseded in experience. Certainty gives place to truth. Okay? Sense certainty gives place to truth. The concept dog does not bark. Right? If you want to think of it that way. Right? Right? But once you, you know, anyway, right? Does not bark. Okay? Okay? But now there's arisen, which did not emerge in these previous relationships, that is, a certainty which is identical with its truth. For the certainty is to itself its own object, and consciousness is to itself the truth. In this there is indeed an otherness. That is to say, consciousness makes a distinction, but one which at the same time is for consciousness not a distinction. If we give the name of notion to the movement of knowing, right, and the name of object to knowing as a passive unity, or as the I, then we see that not only for us, but for knowing itself, the object corresponds to the notion. Or alternatively, if we call notion what the object is in itself, but call the object what it is qua object, or for another, then it is clear that being in itself and being for self are one and the same. For the in itself is consciousness, but equally it is that for which another, the in itself, is. It is for consciousness that the in itself of the object and the being of the object for another are one and the same. The I is the content of the connection and the connecting itself. Opposed to another, the I is its own self, and at the same time it overarches the other, which for the I is equally only the I itself. Okay, you get that? I mean, so this is the beginning against kind of just positing outside. The ego and its posits. Right? The relational movement. It's ego. So, with self-consciousness, then we have entered the native realm of truth. Native realm of truth. We have now to see how the shape of self-consciousness makes its appearance. First makes its appearance. If we consider this new shape of knowing, the knowing of itself, in relation to what preceded it, that is, the knowing of another, then we see that through this other has indeed vanished. Its moments at the same time no less been preserved, and the loss consists in this, that here they are present as they are in themselves. The mere being of what is merely meant, the singleness and universality opposed to it of perception, but also the empty inner being of the understanding. These are no longer essences, but are moments. So no longer do we think of this as an essentializing tendency, the in itself, but we think of this now as moments of self-consciousness. I'm going to put that on the board, because now that's where we are, that's a shift, right? We're in the moments of self-consciousness, right? Very important. This is a shift. No longer do you have this essentializing. This is why identity politics is totally full of it. Okay? Think of it as moments, not as fixities of essences. You know, I'm this, I'm that, I'm whatever. I mean, sexual preference and identity is so complex. To say you're this or that in a certain way is so far away from a Hegelian truth. I mean, yeah. I mean, really, when you begin to think about this, how complicated it is.
You know, that was what Zizek was saying in his attack on identity politics.
No, right. That's one level of the attack. Yeah, absolutely. How can we possibly say we're this way or that way when the complexity is so deep? Right? I mean, yeah. And it takes away from the moments. It takes away from these moments of self-consciousness. Yeah. You know, it's like the surrealists, you know, I'm anything you want me to be when they're at the border. Right? You know the story, right? When they ask them for the passport, well, I can be this one, that one, whatever. All these shifts in identity. Because identity ultimately is just a way of governmental, control, ultimately. Right? It's a bureaucratic category. Identitarian thinking. How long do you plan to stay? What will you be doing? Who are you visiting? Think about borders, in this context, and identity, and what this means. What the passport really means, in a way. It's not a passport going through modes of, or moments of self-consciousness. It's about identity, and it can reinforcing identity in many ways. So anyway, I'm riffing on this a little bit, but I want you to see that moments is very important rather than the in itself, right? The en soi in French, or the in itself in English, the in sich in German, are all, category here that really lead to essentializing tendencies. Yeah, and you can replace this by the moments. Yeah. Abstractions or distinctions, which at the same time have no reality for consciousness and are purely vanishing entities. It seems that the only principal moment has been lost, that is the simple, self-sufficient existence for consciousness. But in fact, self-consciousness is the reflection out of the being of the world of sense and perception, and essentially the return from otherness, right? You come back to the self, right? Back to self-consciousness. As self-consciousness, it is movement that's in which distinguishes itself from itself is only itself as itself. The difference as an otherness is immediately superseded for it. The difference is not, and it, self-consciousness, is only the motionless tautology, I am I. But since for it the difference does not have the form of being, it is not self-consciousness. Hence, otherness is for it in the form of a being, or as a distinct moment, but there is also for consciousness the union of itself with its difference as a second distinct moment. We're going to have to go over this carefully, somewhat next time too. With the first moment, self-consciousness, right, is in the form of consciousness and the whole expanse. So you can see where he's trying to, again, through his introduction, and life and self-consciousness go back to the 3 previous chapters in order to say what this self-consciousness is versus that of consciousness in general. Okay? You see, this is the strategy here. This is the writing strategy and the philosophical strategy, obviously. Right? Okay? And with that moment is the form of consciousness, and the whole expanse of the sensuous world is preserved for it. But at the same time only is connected with the second movement, the unity of self-consciousness with itself. And hence the sensuous world is for it an enduring existence, which however is only appearance or a difference which in itself is no difference. The antithesis of its appearance and its truth has, however, for its essence only the truth, that is the unity of self-consciousness with itself. This unity must become essential to self-consciousness, so self-consciousness itself is desire. Okay? So this is the first mention of the word desire. Proposition 166, section on self-consciousness. The first time he uses it. Desire in general. So it has a double object. One is the immediate object, that of sense certainty and perception. What you're looking at. Right? Something like that, right? Are you sure? You sure? You like me, or you sure about these kind of things, right? Etc. Right? And which, however, for self-consciousness has the character of a negative, and the second itself, which is the true essence, and is present in the first instance only as opposed to the first object. In this sphere, self-consciousness exhibits itself as the movement in which this antithesis is removed and the identity of itself with itself becomes explicit for us. Okay? So this is where desire is first mentioned, right? Desire in general. The first working, model of desire in modern, philosophy. Okay? But for us, 168, or in itself, the object which for self-consciousness is the negative element has, on its side, returned into itself, just as on the other side, consciousness is done. Through this reflection into itself, the object has become life. So hence what I put up here, life and self-consciousness, alongside a desire. This is the shift in the quote attitude. What self-consciousness distinguishes from itself as having being, also has in it, insofar as its positive being, not merely the character of sense, certainty, and perception, but it is being that is reflected into itself, and the object of immediate desire is a living thing. For the in itself, or the universal result of the relation of the understanding to the inwardness of things, is the distinguishing of what is not to be distinguished, or the unity of what is distinguished. But this unity, as we have seen, just as much as its repulsion its repulsion from itself, and this notion sunders itself into the antithesis of self-consciousness in life. The former is the unity for which the infinite unity of the differences is. The latter, however, is only this unity itself, so it is not at the same time for itself. To this extent, consciousness is independent, so too is its object, but only implicitly. Self-consciousness, which is simply for itself and directly characterizes its object as a negative element, or is primarily desire, will therefore, on the contrary, learn through experience that the object is independent, not in us. Right? The determination of life as it is issued from the notion or the general result which we have to enter this sphere is sufficient to characterize it without having to further develop its nature. Its sphere is defined in the following moments. Number one, essence is infinity as the supersession of all distinctions, the pure movement of axial rotation, its self-reposed being, an absolutely restless infinity, independence itself, in which the differences of the movement are resolved, the simple essence of time, which in this equality with itself has the stable shape of space. I mean, this is very dense. I mean, in a sense, we have to talk about this. I mean, again, I have question marks all over my book here. The differences, however, are just as much present as differences in the simple universal medium, for the universal flux has negative nature only in being the supersession of them. It cannot supersede the different moments if they do not have an enduring existence. It is its very flux as a self-identical independence, which is in itself an enduring existence, in which therefore they are present as distinct members and parts existing on their account. Being no longer has the significance of abstract being, nor has their pure essentiality the significance of abstract universality. On the contrary, their being is precisely that simple fluid substance of pure movement within itself. The difference, however, qua difference of these members with respect to one another, consists in general in no other determinateness than that of the moments of infinity or of the pure movement itself. So again, we're looking at, this dialectical movement, right? Another thing, constantly moving, right? Not stopping or fixed, in a sense, right? And the in itself, right? No longer are we in this moment of where we've incorporated the object, right? Right? We're looking at what consciousness is doing, right? At this point. Yeah. Okay. And all right. So, I mean, any thoughts or questions? I mean, we're going to have to go through this at least in another 2 weeks. Yeah. 2 sessions. Yeah. Go ahead.
The what's his name?
Miller?
No, Finlay. He has like his little summary of that section is a little bit helpful, although probably misleading.
Fair enough. Well, I don't know. I mean,
It's short.
Okay.
He says the essence of life is infinity as the supersession of all distinctions. Tranquility seated at the center of axial rotation. The moving essence of time congealed into spatial solidity. All distinctions in the living organism pass away in flux, but must have a momentary solidity and separateness in order to pass away in this manner.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Fluidity, pure movement is the essence of the living.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Yeah. It makes it much more accessible than,
In the translation.
no labor though.
Well, yeah, there's no labor that's going on with you, right, in a sense, because it's setting up a frame for you to work. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but you can go back and now read it and say, is this what he's really doing? Right. I mean, he says about desire on the preceding page, the nature of desire, to abolish the otherness of the other.
Right.
You want the other to be the same as you.
Right.
You want unity of the same. It's very hard to find people where they allow the otherness of the other to really play out in relationships and stuff. There's always a struggle for someone to be be like them, right? Don't you see, you know how these things go all the time. Yeah. Instead of really letting the other play out, right?
Yeah.
Letting it be the way it is. I think, this is much more important. I think good psychoanalysts know this. Yeah.
To let them be.
Let the otherness and the differences really play out.
Yeah.
Right? And not the way it's done in identity politics. Not the way it's done in the high schools or in the classrooms, right? But to let the play of forces play out and see what's going on. Yeah. So I think this is also very, very important too. He's fixated, Mr. Finley, on fluidity here. You can see, he goes through fluidity, through many other, yeah. But anyway, okay, well, yeah. Then the dividedness, right? Okay, where desire comes up again, if you turn to page 109, right, the simple I is the genus or the simple universal for which, 174, in which the differences are not differences, only by its being the negative essence of the shared independent moments. And self-consciousness is thus certain of itself only by superseding this other that presents itself to self-consciousness as an independent life. Self-consciousness is desire, right? Certain of the nothingness of this other, it explicitly affirms that the nothingness is for it the truth of the other. It destroys the independent object and thereby gives it the certainty of itself as a true certainty, a certainty which has become explicit for self-consciousness itself in an objective manner. In this satisfaction, however, experience makes it aware that the object has its own independence. Desire and self-certainty obtained in its gratification are conditioned by the object. For self-certainty comes from superseding this other. In order that this supersession can take place, there must be this other. Thus, self-consciousness, by its negative relation to the object, is unable to supersede it. It is really because of that relation that it produces the object again and the desire as well. It is in fact something other than self-consciousness that is the essence of desire. And through this experience, self-consciousness has realized this truth. So this is important. It is in fact something other than self-consciousness that is the essence of desire. Okay? And this is a very Spinozist comment, in a way. This is why, in a way, I think that many of the Althusarians and the people that went back there, they saw in Spinoza a very different notion. Spinoza didn't really have a theory of consciousness, right? It was desire, right, in the ethics, the passions of desire. And this was really part of, the determinate negation would get us closer to desire. But at the same time, it's no less absolutely for itself, and it's only so by superseding the object, and it must experience its satisfaction, for it is the truth. On the account of the independence of the object, therefore it can achieve satisfaction only when the object itself affects the negation within itself, and it must carry out this negation of itself in itself, for it is in itself the negative, and must be for the other what it is. This is the labor of the negative. Again, very difficult for us to comprehend because we don't use this language when we're growing up, right? Anyway, in the sphere of life, which is the object of desire, page 110, negation is present either in another, that is, in desire, or as a determinateness opposed to another in different form, or as the inorganic universal nature of life. But this universal independent nature in which negation is present as absolute negation is the genus as such, or the genus as self-consciousness. Self-consciousness achieves its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. So now we have the beginning of, self-consciousness and the other, right? Right? So, 176, and maybe we can end here, is completed in these three moments. the pure, undifferentiated I in its first immediate object. B, that this immediacy itself is an absolute mediation. It is only as a supersession of the independent object. In other words, it is desire. The satisfaction of desire is, it is true, the reflection of self-consciousness into itself, or the certainty that has become truth. But the truth of this certainty is really a double reflection, the duplication of self-consciousness. Consciousness has, for its object, one which of its own self posits its otherness, or difference as a nothingness, and in so doing is independent. The differentiated, merely living shape does indeed also supersede its independence in the process of life, but it ceases with its distinctive difference to be what it is. The object of self-consciousness, however, is equally independent in this negativity of itself, and thus it is only for itself a genus, a universal fluid element in the peculiarity of its own separate being. It is a living self-consciousness. Okay. So self-consciousness exists for another self-consciousness, only so in fact self-consciousness, for only in this way does the unity of itself in its otherhood become explicit for it. The I, which is the object of its notion, is in fact not object. The object of desire, however, is only independent, for it is the universal, indestructible substance, the fluid, self-identical essence. A self-consciousness in being an object is just as much as I as object. With this, we have already had before us the notion of spirit. What still lies ahead of us is the experience of what spirit is, this absolute substance, which is the unity of the different independent self-consciousnesses, which in their opposition enjoy perfect freedom and independence. I that is we,
Right.
we that is an I. It is in self-consciousness, in the notion of spirit, that consciousness first finds its turning point, where it leaves behind it the colorful show of the sensuous here and now, and the night-like void of the supersensible beyond, and steps out into the spiritual daylight of the present.
Mm-hmm.
Good, huh? Yeah. So,
The I that is
okay,
we.
yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry?
No, the I that is we and the we that is I.
Yes, that's correct. And to be thinking this way always is a real trick in self-consciousness, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is really what the structure of self-reflection and then ultimately self-consciousness. Consciousness of self reflecting on the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
In this I-we relationship, right? And so in this section here, this is the first section, if you will, of self-consciousness, right? We have two more sections to go, really: the lordship and bondage, and then of course the freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's going to give us the historical lesson in 178, begins independence and dependence, right, etc. And he'll talk more about desire there, and also the play of forces that consciousness has, right? Again, this first, 100 and something pages of the phenomenology is really about coming to consciousness, coming to self-consciousness,
Yeah.
right? And being able to understand how this happened through sense certainty, perception, how you perceive things, and then ultimately force and understanding, and then how you got from the I to the we,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what that's about, right? And what are these moments of transition that allow you to proceed there, right? So this is the facing, the confrontation, the struggle is in the next section. This is descriptive, this first part today, so I should put that up there, that this part here about the attitude of desire and the moments, etc., and the beginning, and this description of the first bit is a descriptive element, right? It's a description of self-consciousness, right? So that's the first movement.
It's a little bit like the way that he does force initially too.
Yes, exactly.
Really dry,
Yeah.
abstract.
Yes, exactly. And then he gets going into it because you have the terms to work with. He's introducing you first to the changing of the attitude, the changing of the terrain, and then he's summarizing, right? He'll give you the summary of the first 3 chapters, how consciousness has absorbed, if you will, right? Taken in, the of, right? Conscious of, self, consciousness of the self-certainty, the perception and the force and understanding, and how we go for there before we get into the struggle for recognition and the struggle of the master-slave for death. So this is a very crucial, I think a very crucial moment, right? Yeah. So the first attitude here is the attitude of desire. Right. Because desire is self-consciousness, right? In some ways, right? And understanding that it is the desire of the other, right? The desire to appropriate the other. Freud did not have it so far away. We're all murderers, cannibals. Again, right? Right?
Yeah.
But totem and taboo.
And the goal for him is the realization of spirit.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. So anyway,
So then, in the 4th chapter, he sets up these abstract terms, and then he shows these really concrete examples, magnetism.
Well, I think he's moving from, an abstraction to a more concrete, although we try to think of it as concrete than towards the abstract, because we're getting,
And in this section, he does sort of the same thing. He sets up these abstract terms, and then he gives you this myth of the lordship bondage, right?
Yeah, this is the myth, but it's also a historical moment, as Susan Buck-Morse and others pointed out, that 1791 was the Santo Domingo slave uprising, is something that Hegel is basically reflecting on here. The Toussaint is the servitude in which the reinteriorization of the master Napoleonic moment, or the French Revolution that has educated him, right, in the abolition of slavery, is taken up as a new attitude of desire, right, that ultimately plays out in terms of the struggle for recognition through abolition and taking of the government with Desmond and others, that this becomes a very, very crucial thing. And like you can see in here, black skin, white masks, too, because the white masks continue to play in the desire of the other, right? Or what does the black have to wear in order to stay alive, right? In certain, moments, right?
And it makes sense too, because in the previous chapter, it was pretty much literal examples from contemporary science or something.
Right.
And so it would only make sense that he would actually draw from real life events this lordship and bondage section too.
Right. And remember, look, we talked a little bit about this, the language again. How have we gone from black power regressively back to Black Lives Matter? Aren't we back here to moments of life, right? Instead of this struggle for recognition. We really haven't entered, we're back at a very elementary abstraction, right? That the Black Lives Matter, in a way. I know it's a movement. I know it's important. I'm not knocking it as a movement or the people in it. I'm just saying, let's look at the historical regression, in a firm and active way, and look at it through the Hegelian dialectic, if you will, in a sense. That it's back to Leben. It's life that matters with self-consciousness, not the struggle for recognition or the struggle for freedom. Right? It's interesting, right? When you begin to look at this, how much we've regressed since this strategy, this Stokely Carmichael, Charles Hamilton moment of the 1960s, and now it's taken up. Tragedy and farce in a way, in a literary context. Yes, absolutely. And you can talk, I know last week you mentioned the will to power, and the 2 weeks before that. I mean, you can talk about will to power here as well, vis-a-vis life, but Nietzsche has this too, because you can talk about the biological, right, and consciousness too, right? So this opens up many, many fields. I'm just trying to say, we can read this and we can begin to see, the transitions and become more acclimated to this process of thinking, right? This is a process of thinking. How do you make a transition from money transformed into capital? This is a similar kind of moment, right, in some ways, in Marx, right? This dialectical movement, right? Yeah. What is the transformation problem about? What is the immediate processes of production about? Right? Yeah. When he does this, he's using similar language in a way, in a different context. But yeah. So if you can see that, I think we're on to something, and it's worthwhile struggling through this text and spending some time with it.
I mean, it's definitely worth it. I mean, the lordship and bondage section is very beautiful too.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Yeah. And
what year was this published?
1807. And the preface was written afterwards, after Napoleon had come into Vienna and the cannon fire went out, outside, the world historical figure on horseback. That was his metaphor. Yeah. And remember, look, again, another metaphor that's interesting here. There are two interesting metaphors in Hegel throughout this book, at least to my mind in the immediate sense. The highway of despair. You're always in that kind of contingent position on those roads, right? In some ways. But at the same time, you're at the twilight, the Minerva that takes flight at dusk. So this summary each time that we're going through, right, and the attitudinal shift is the owl of Minerva that's taking flight from the previous thing onto the next moment, right? Right? If you want to look at it that way. The recapitulation of all the day's events and all of the history of philosophy, etc. And Marx, on the other hand, to use another metaphor, is like the Joker in the deck of cards. He knows all the games of philosophy, and he knows how they're reproduced, and he's the one that flushes out the 4 kings into something more, the 5 kings, or the royal straight flush or something. He becomes the Joker in the pack of cards, in some ways. I'm being very, glib and metaphorical here, but I think it's interesting when you begin to think about it this way. Take a metaphor like the owl of Minerva and think about that, what's being recapitulated in this moment. What is the dialectics of impeachment? What is this really about? I mean, I know it's a clown show, I know it's a circus and all that, but put it into a historical framework, into a historical frame, in a sense. What does this mean, in a sense of this movement? The sense certainty is telling us, oh, Trump's going to do great with this, they don't have anything. You go to perception, you begin to see other kind of, think about this way. What is the force? What is most people's understanding of it? How is this relationally to the play of forces? But then once we get to self-consciousness, isn't there something really going on here? Are we at that existential impasse, right? Can this be penetrated? Can it be broken through? Can the aporia be overcome? Yeah. So this is something that I think is very crucial for us to think about. So why don't we think about, I plan to be here. I'll let you know if I'm not. I'm trying to get up to Montreal, but I think I'm going to be here next Tuesday.
Okay.
And I'll send out a message. I'll try to synthesize this on the email. Again, I'm trying to diagram it to help you. I hope this is helping, like last time, and a little bit here, and the thing about reading it as a Bildung as well as a philosophical novel, etc. But it really is, to my mind, the story of consciousness. The main character so far is the coming to consciousness, right? This is the center stage.
Okay.
Okay?
Sounds good. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.